I think the first thing to say is that most often the humanitarian coordinator is also the resident coordinator, so he has this double-headed function. But sometimes when we don't actually designate a humanitarian coordinator, and the resident coordinator, in the event of some sudden natural disaster, has to take on this coordination function without actually being called a humanitarian coordinator. In any case, the responsibilities tend to be very much the same, and this can happen to a resident coordinator in the event of a long-running complex emergency, a conflict situation, a sudden disaster, a flood, a hurricane, or whatever, an earthquake, or of course a slow onset disaster like a drought. And these are very common these days, and will be increasingly common with climate change creating more and more intense disasters. So these responsibilities are likely to be more frequent, I think, for resident coordinators and for humanitarian coordinators. Whether it's a double-hatted person or not, the responsibilities are significant. It's your job to organise a coordinated response to that emergency, whatever shape it might take, a coordinated response plan to make sure that all the UN agencies, but also the NGOs and the other actors in the humanitarian community are working together, hopefully in support of the government if the government is in the lead, as it normally should be. You need to raise resources for that response, or help raise resources for that response at a local level. You may need to speak out about certain principles which need to be respected. You need to make sure that the response is timely. But also, it's not only about response. Very often it's also a responsibility of resident coordinators to make sure that the system, but also the government to which they're accredited, are prepared for a disaster. So preparedness, encouraging preparedness, making sure preparedness is there, is also a responsibility, as is promoting, particularly in the context of climate change, disaster risk reduction measures to make sure that when disasters happen, they are not, the impact is as reduced as it can be in the circumstances. And again, that's something we're putting increasing emphasis on. You need to be someone who can bring together a lot of different actors. Of course, there are the major UN agencies who are engaged in humanitarian response, the World Food Programme, UNHCR, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and a number of others. But there's many other actors too. Of course, there's the government, who should be in the lead, but sometimes in conflict situations they're also a party to the conflict, and therefore you have a difficult relationship with them. There are then the NGOs, of whom there may be very many. You're responsible for coordinating their efforts as well, but of course they remain independent, so that's a difficult constituency to manage. And then there is even more independent, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Federation of the Red Cross and their local representative, the local Red Cross or Red Crescent organization. You need to bring all these actors together and make sure they're acting together in a coordinated plan, that resources are being raised for all of them. And you also need to make sure that the government is acting, you are acting, all these others are acting in accordance with the humanitarian principles of independence and neutrality and impartiality and response to need. And you need to make sure that international human rights law and international humanitarian law are being respected in whatever response is being given. That means occasionally speaking out, saying things the government may not want to hear, for example, which is a difficult role, particularly for someone who's a resident coordinator, but that's an essential part of it. So there's a lot of skills need to go together, a lot of leadership skills, a lot of coordination skills, so it's quite a challenge. Well, this is very important because one of the things that's been increasingly recognized is that humanitarian coordination, leadership on the ground is crucial if we're going to get the response right, as well as preparedness and disaster risk reduction. So that means actually strengthening the role of the humanitarian coordinator or the resident coordinator, whether it's not a humanitarian coordinator. What we're trying to do is make sure that the resident coordinator or humanitarian coordinator has support. That means support from OCHA. Where there's an OCHA office, that OCHA office is directly responsible, directly reports to the humanitarian coordinator. Therefore, he has that support, those resources to call on. We're trying to make sure that resident coordinators, humanitarian coordinators receive a lot more training in humanitarian coordination, in humanitarian response, in international humanitarian and human rights law. We're trying to make sure that the selection of RCs and HCs also reflects the need to have these qualities and these skills before they're sent out. And we're also trying to make sure that there is a professional and predictable performance appraisal system for those humanitarian coordination functions, so that's properly reflected in the overall assessment being made of a resident coordinator. I think there are three big challenges you can see, perhaps. One is the fact that you need to respond very, very fast indeed when there's a new emergency. Everybody's taken by surprise. By definition, it's chaotic. That's what disasters are. That's what they mean. So you need to get a lot of people moving, a lot of people reacting very quickly and acting together and with the government. And that itself is a major challenge. I think the second big challenge is the skills to bring together a lot of people who are diverse, who have different mandates, who are independent in their own right, and yet need to be brought together. You need to form a consensus, you need to get them around the table, you need to form a proper humanitarian country team. And that's one of the prerequisites for a proper response these days. And then you need this ability to speak out when necessary as well, and to make sure that principles are being respected. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult things. It can be one of the most rewarding things, but it means dealing with the media. It means saying things that people around you may not want to hear, prefer you hadn't said, are putting pressure on you not to say. So I think if you add all these three things together, it is a major challenge, but that's what makes it such an exciting job at the same time. Well, I think particularly, I can only speak from the humanitarian side, I think this is one of the most rewarding jobs that you can do, because if you can get all these challenges that I've been talking about right, bringing a lot of diverse actors together, actually making a difference on the ground, saving people's lives, preserving their livelihoods, giving them some opportunity to survive an appalling situation in a minimum of dignity, then you can really say to yourself afterwards, when you can breathe a sigh of relief, I've actually made a difference. What I've helped to do has made a difference in challenging circumstances. That's what I joined public service for, that's what I joined the United Nations for. And that's why I think it is a unique challenge, but it's also uniquely rewarding as well.